Get out. You couldn't afford to pay for even a corner of that painting. Grant Whitmore's shout thundered through the gallery, sharp enough to silence what little conversation remained. He pointed straight toward the front doors. Everyone, move aside. Let her out. Annie stood frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers. In one hand, she still held the cleaning cloth she had carefully folded. A damp patch marked her gray uniform where she had just wiped down a table in the hallway. Her work shoes were so worn that one lace had been knotted where the plastic tip had broken off long ago. Less than 2 steps away, Lady Beneath the Cypress hung on the wall with a long tear running across the pale blue dress of the woman in the portrait. Dozens of guests in tuxedos and evening gowns were staring at Annie. Some made no attempt to hide their curiosity. Others lowered their eyes to their wine glasses and pretended not to see. Annie swallowed hard. Mr. Whitmore, please listen to me for 1 minute. I didn't tear that painting. Grant spun around. What else could you possibly have to say? Mr. Briggs called me in here after it had already happened. I was cleaning the table in the hallway. I never touched the painting. Walter Briggs immediately stepped forward. Sir, she's been saying the same thing for several minutes now. Annie looked at him, because it's the truth. Walter did not even bother looking at her. He kept his eyes on Grant and lowered his voice with practiced respect. She knows the house is full of guests. She thinks that if she drags this out long enough, you won't want to make a scene and you'll eventually let her off. Annie stared at him in disbelief. You know perfectly well that you were the one who called me in here. Walter turned toward her. Stop lying. I'm not lying. Annie. Walter lowered his voice, but the warning in his eyes was unmistakable. Knowing when to keep quiet is part of your job too. Annie tightened her grip on the cloth. So telling the truth is wrong now? Grant stepped forward. Enough. Annie turned to him. Sir, check the cameras. I said enough. Just check what time I entered this room. It'll only take a few minutes. Grant looked at her as though her pleading only irritated him more. Do you think I need a housemaid telling me how to run my own home? Annie faltered. No, sir. I just want you to know what really happened. A man in a navy dinner jacket stepped out from the group of guests. Preston Hale. He touched the cufflink at his wrist, looking far less comfortable than he had a few minutes earlier. Grant, wait. I think I need to say something. Grant turned toward him. Preston looked at the painting. I was standing near it before anyone noticed the tear. I turned around and felt my sleeve catch on something. I heard something rip. It may have been me. No, Mr. Hale. Walter cut him off so quickly that Preston turned to stare at him. Walter stepped closer, perfectly composed. You only brushed against the frame after the damage had already been done. I saw Annie standing here before that. Annie whipped around toward him. You're lying. Several guests immediately looked at her. Walter frowned. Did you just call me a liar in front of Mr. Whitmore? Because you are lying. Annie, you saw me in the hallway. You were the one who called my name. I even asked you what you wanted. Walter turned back to Grant. Sir, you see what I mean. No remorse. No understanding of her place. The more she's questioned, the louder she gets. Annie almost laughed from sheer disbelief. I'm supposed to feel remorse for something I didn't do? Preston stepped forward again. Walter, I really did hear something tear. Walter gave him the faintest smile. You've had a few bourbons tonight, Mr. Hale. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Preston stared at him. Are you saying I don't know what I did? I'm only saying that your memory may not be entirely reliable. Annie turned to Grant. You heard him. Even when the man who may have torn the painting says it could have been him, Mr. Briggs finds a way to dismiss it. Grant looked at Preston, then at Walter. Finally, his eyes settled on Annie. The cheap uniform, the worn shoes, the cleaning cloth in her hand. He asked no more questions. I've known Walter for almost 20 years. Annie looked at him. And you've known me for a few months. That's right. I understand that. Her voice softened. But someone can work for you for 20 years and still lie to you. Walter gave a contemptuous laugh. You honestly think your word carries the same weight as mine? Annie looked him straight in the eye. I think the truth doesn't care who makes more money. Grant stepped closer until he was directly in front of her. Watch yourself. Annie lifted her chin. I'm not disrespecting you. You're standing in the middle of my home, in front of my guests, arguing with my house manager over a painting worth nearly $10 million. And I still didn't tear it. Grant let out a cold laugh. $10 million, Annie. He pointed at the painting. Do you have any idea what that number means? Yes. No, you don't. His eyes dropped to her shoes. You could work from dawn to dark for the rest of your life and still not be able to afford the frame. Several people in the room looked away. Annie remained still. Grant continued, "How much do you make a week?" A faint smirk touched Walter's mouth. Annie did not answer. Grant asked again, "How much?" "That has nothing to do with this. That's exactly the problem. Nothing matters to you until somebody else has to pay for it." Annie blinked. "Are you using the fact that I'm poor as proof that I'm guilty?" Grant stared at her coldly. "I'm saying that if you can't afford to replace something you damage, you should have enough sense to stay away from it." "But I did stay away from it." "Enough." Grant snatched the cleaning cloth from her hand. Annie flinched. He threw it onto the table beside them. "You were hired to clean floors, clean bathrooms, pick up what other people leave behind. The job is simple enough that I didn't think it needed further explanation." Annie stared at the cloth lying on the table. Heat rose into her cheeks. "Cleaning someone's house doesn't make me less than anyone else in this room." Walter laughed. Grant did not. He looked at her so coldly that Annie knew her words had not reached him at all. "In this house you are an employee." "Yes, and when I tell you to leave, you leave." Annie drew a breath. "Mr. Whitmore, please check the cameras before you fire me." "No, just give me until morning." "No, I need this job." Grant turned away. Annie took one step after him. "I'm saving for college." He stopped, but did not turn around. "My tuition deadline is only a few weeks away. I've taken every extra shift Mr. Briggs gave me. I've never complained. I've never walked away from a job before it was finished. Please don't take all of that away from me for something I didn't do." Grant turned back. "Are you trying to make me feel sorry for you?" Annie froze. "No. It certainly sounds like it. I'm asking you to be fair." "Fair?" Grant looked around the room as though Annie had said something childish. "You were standing beside damaged property. My house manager says you were there. I don't need to turn my home into a courtroom just because you're afraid of losing a job." Annie looked at him. "So my word isn't worth 5 minutes of your time?" "Not tonight." The short answer silenced her. Outside, lightning flashed beyond the tall windows. Rain began hammering against the glass. Annie glanced outside before speaking again. "Then please at least let me stay until morning." Grant frowned. "What?" "I live in the staff room behind the house. I don't have anywhere else ready to go. There's a storm outside." Walter immediately stepped in. "Sir, if she's been dismissed, she shouldn't remain on the property." Annie looked at Walter. "I wasn't talking to you." Walter's expression hardened. Grant turned toward her. "You're leaving tonight." For a moment, Annie thought she had misheard him. "Tonight?" "Yes, but it's pouring outside." Grant looked toward the windows for the first time. Then he looked back at her. "And?" One word. Annie clasped her hands together. "I don't have a car. Call a cab. I don't even know if one can get all the way out here in this storm." "That's no longer my problem." Annie stared at him for a long moment. "You're really going to throw me out tonight?" Grant did not blink. "Do you want me to say it a third time?" Walter turned toward 2 staff members standing near the doorway. "Go to her room. Bring everything down." Annie immediately turned toward him. "No." Walter raised an eyebrow. "I'll get my own things. You no longer have the right to walk freely through this house. They're my belongings." "Then you'd better hurry." Annie looked at Grant. "Please, I only have 1 suitcase. I'll pack it myself." Grant waved a dismissive hand. 10 minutes. Annie remained where she was. Grant looked at his watch. "Now you have 9. Several guests lowered their heads. Preston stepped forward. "Grant, this is too much." Grant turned toward him. "This is an internal matter." "No. I just told you I may have been the one who tore that painting." Walter tried to interrupt. "Mr. Hale." Preston raised a hand. "I'm talking to Grant." Grant stared at him. Preston lowered his voice. "You're throwing an 18-year-old girl out into a storm over something no one has even proven she did." Grant answered coldly. "And I don't need your permission to decide who stays in my house." Annie heard him. She said nothing more. She bent down to pick up the cloth Grant had thrown aside. Walter stopped her. "Leave it." Annie picked it up anyway. "I used it. I'll put it where it belongs." Walter held out his hand. "Give it to me." Annie carefully folded the cloth and placed it on the cleaning cart. "No need. I know how to do my job." The remark made Walter's face redden. Grant turned away. "Get her out." The 2 staff members looked at each other. Neither of them moved. Annie looked at them and spoke quietly. "You don't have to. I can walk out on my own." She headed toward the staff hallway. After only a few steps, Grant called from behind her. "Annie, She stopped. For one brief moment, she thought he had changed his mind. Grant said, "If the insurance company determines that you're responsible, my lawyers will contact you." Annie slowly turned around. "You're going to sue me too?" "If necessary." "With what money?" Grant shrugged. "That's something you should have thought about before touching something that didn't belong to you." Annie's eyes reddened. "You know I'm saving for college." "I know. And you'd still sue me?" Grant answered without hesitation. "If you caused the damage, your future is not my responsibility." Annie stood motionless. No one in the room said a word. Grant continued, his voice even colder now. "Maybe spending years paying for this will teach you that there are things in this world you simply cannot afford to be careless with." This time Annie did not plead. She just looked at him. For a long time, when she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, but clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "You don't know anything about me," Grant replied. "I know enough." Annie gave a small nod. "No, you only know what uniform I wear." For one beat, Grant said nothing. Annie turned away. 10 minutes later, she returned carrying an old suitcase and a cloth bag with frayed straps. Walter stood by the door. "Put your employee badge on the table." Annie pulled the badge from her pocket. She looked at it for a second before setting it down. Walter pulled it toward himself with 2 fingers, as though he did not want to touch something she had just handled. "Room key." Annie placed the key beside the badge. "Anything else?" Walter looked at the old bag. "Search her belongings." Annie's head snapped up. "What?" Walter turned to the security staff. "We've just lost a piece of property worth nearly $10 million. I'm not letting her leave with anything that belongs to this house." Annie pulled the bag tightly against her body. "Are you accusing me of stealing now?" Walter did not answer. Grant stood several feet away. Annie looked at him. "You think that too?" Grant did not answer right away. His silence was enough. Annie slowly lowered the bag onto the stone floor. "Fine." She opened it herself. "I'll take everything out." One by one, she placed her belongings on a chair near the entrance. 2 shirts, a pair of jeans, an old pair of sneakers, a college entrance exam study book, a university envelope, a small framed photograph. No jewelry, no silver, nothing that belonged to Grant Whitmore. Annie looked at Walter. "Is that enough?" Walter gave the items a quick glance. "Fine." Annie put everything back. Her hand trembled when she picked up the framed photograph, but she tried not to let anyone notice. Grant noticed. He still said nothing. Walter opened the front door. A blast of cold wind and rain immediately swept across the marble floor. Annie stood at the threshold. The wind caught her hair and tossed it across her face. Preston called out from behind her. "Annie, wait. I can call a car for you." She turned around. "Thank you, but I'll manage." Then Annie looked at Grant one last time. "Mr. Whitmore." Grant lifted his head. "You said that painting is worth nearly $10 million. "Yes." Annie nodded. "I hope it was worth it." Grant frowned. "What do you mean?" "Worth deciding that someone is a liar just because she's poorer than everyone else in the room." Walter started to speak. Annie did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Grant. "I hope that someday, when you need someone to believe you, they give you more than 5 minutes." Then she lifted her suitcase. One of its wheels was broken, causing it to tilt to one side. Instead of rolling it, Annie had to carry it. Walter stepped aside. "Go." Annie walked out. Rain soaked her shoulders almost instantly. She went down the first stone step, then the second. Behind her, the massive doors of Whitmore House slowly began to close. Just before they came together, Annie heard Walter say, "Sir, I'll call the restoration specialist right away. Don't let this little incident ruin your evening." Annie stood in the rain, the heavy suitcase in her hand. Her job was gone. Her home was gone. The money she had saved for college might no longer be enough. And the man inside that mansion had just threatened to take away what was left of her future over something she had never done. Annie lowered her head, tightened her grip on the worn strap of her bag, and continued down the rain-slick stone steps. Annie had barely reached the staff hallway when the tears she had been holding back since leaving the gallery finally blurred her vision. She quickly wiped them from her cheeks with the back of her hand and kept walking. Behind the heavy doors that had already closed, music from the ballroom continued to play, only slightly softer than before. The room Annie had been given was at the end of the hallway, so small that there was barely enough space for a single bed, an old desk, and a narrow wardrobe pressed against the wall. She stepped inside, closed the door, and stood beside the bed for several seconds. When she had first arrived at Whitmore House, she had thought the room was tiny. Tonight, as she prepared to leave without even knowing where she would sleep, Annie realized it had become the closest thing to a home she had had in months. She pulled her old suitcase from beneath the bed. One of the wheels had been broken since spring, and the zipper often caught at one corner, but Annie had never considered replacing it. Every dollar she could save went toward tuition. She lifted the suitcase onto the bed, opened it, and began folding her clothes with hands that were still trembling. 2 pairs of jeans went in first, followed by several shirts, her toiletries, and the nursing textbooks she had bought secondhand from an older student to save money. Finally, Annie reached under the desk and took out a pair of black shoes. She brushed a speck of dust from the toe and carefully placed them inside the suitcase. They were nothing special, just an inexpensive pair from a discount store, but Annie had worked 3 extra weekend cleaning shifts to afford them. She had planned to wear them on her first day of college, along with the white blouse her mother had once said made her look like a real nurse. Annie looked at the shoes for another second before laying a sweater over them. There was a knock at the door. Just one. Then the door opened before Annie had a chance to answer. Walter Briggs walked in. He did not look around or ask how much she had managed to pack. The first thing he did was glance at the watch on his wrist. "You have 5 minutes." Annie remained bent over the suitcase. "Mr. Whitmore told me to pack my things. That's what I'm doing." "Then do it faster." Annie picked up a textbook from the desk. "I'm not throwing my books into a bag like garbage just to make you happy." Walter glanced at the suitcase and gave a faint, humorless smile. "Under the circumstances, you should consider yourself lucky that Mr. Whitmore is only firing you." Annie's hands stopped in the middle of folding a sweater. She slowly looked up. "Lucky?" He could have called the police. Annie stared at Walter as though she could not believe he had actually said it. "Call the police over a painting I didn't damage? The discussion about the painting is over." "No." Annie straightened. "You want it to be over." Mr. Hale tried to tell Mr. Whitmore what happened, and every time he opened his mouth, you interrupted him. Walter stepped farther into the room. "Watch how you speak to me." A quiet laugh escaped Annie, but there was no amusement in it. "Why? What else can you take from me? My job is already gone. My room is gone too. There's still one thing you might want to think about." Annie looked at him. "A reference?" Annie asked. "Would you actually give me a good one?" Walter did not answer. Annie watched him for another moment, then gave a small nod. "That's what I thought." She turned back to the suitcase. Walter reached over and picked up one of the nursing textbooks from the desk. He flipped through several pages, looking at the passages Annie had marked with a highlighter. "You really still think you're going to college?" Annie immediately took the book from his hand. "Yes." "With what money?" "I'll find a way." Walter laughed. "You couldn't even hold on to a cleaning job." Annie pressed the textbook against her chest. The words made her eyes sting again, but she refused to let the tears fall. "I did hold on to my job," she said. "I showed up on time. I took the shifts nobody else wanted. I worked weekends. I never took a single dollar from this house. You decided I needed to lose my job. Don't turn your decision into my failure." The smile disappeared from Walter's face. "You always have to have something to say, don't you?" Annie looked directly at him. "I used to think that if I stayed quiet and worked hard, people would treat me fairly. Tonight I learned that staying quiet doesn't make a dishonest person more honest." Something changed in Walter's eyes. He took half a step closer to her. At that exact moment, Maria Santos appeared in the doorway. She was still wearing the black uniform of the catering staff, with the white service napkin she had just removed from her wrist still in one hand. "Mr. Briggs, they're looking for you in the ballroom." Walter kept his eyes on Annie. "Who?" "Mr. Whitmore's event coordinator. They said there's an issue with the head table." Walter checked his watch again before turning back to Annie. 5 minutes. "Anything you haven't packed by then will be sent to you later." Annie looked at him. "Sent where?" "I don't even know what address I'll be sleeping at tonight." Walter's expression did not change. "That's not my problem." He walked out. Maria remained where she was until the sound of Walter's shoes disappeared down the hallway. Then she stepped inside and gently closed the door. Annie continued folding clothes. "Please don't say anything right now." Maria stood beside the bed. "I wanted to speak up out there." Annie stopped. "But you didn't." Maria lowered her eyes. "I need this job." The answer hurt Annie, but it only took a few seconds for her anger to fade. She knew Maria had a young son at home, and a mother who needed medication every month. Walter knew that too. Men like him always seemed to know exactly what other people were most afraid of losing. Annie slowly exhaled. "I'm sorry." Maria looked up. "I shouldn't have said that to you. You didn't do this." Maria looked at the half-packed suitcase. "Where are you going to go?" Annie zipped the inner compartment. "I don't know yet. Do you have anyone you can call?" "Yes." The answer left her mouth faster than the truth. Annie had Ruth. Ruth would never shut the door in her face. But the thought of showing up at the woman's home close to midnight, with a suitcase, rain-soaked clothes, and nowhere else to sleep filled Annie with a kind of shame she could not explain. Ruth would never blame her. That somehow made asking for help even harder. Maria did not ask anything else. She bent down and picked up the cardboard box Annie had kept beneath the desk. "I'll help you. You still have work to do." "I know. If Walter sees you, then he sees me." For the first time that evening, the corner of Annie's mouth moved slightly. The two women packed in silence. Maria placed Annie's notebooks into the cardboard box while Annie opened the desk drawer and gathered the few small things she had accumulated during the month she had lived there. Several pens, a phone charger wrapped with tape near the connector, an envelope from the university, an old photograph of her mother, and a thick medical folder. Annie paused when her hand touched the folder. The hospital's logo was printed on the front. Maria noticed it. "You still have to go back to the hospital? Just follow-up appointments? Is something wrong?" Annie quickly placed the folder at the bottom of the canvas bag. "No, I'm fine." Maria looked at her but did not ask again. Annie zipped the bag closed. Her phone vibrated inside her pocket. The screen showed several missed calls from a number she did not recognize and a message from Ruth. "Is your gala over yet?" Annie stared at the question for a long time. She typed, "I got fired." Her finger hovered over the send button. Then she erased it. She tried again. Something happened. She deleted that too. Finally, Annie typed only, "Can I come over tonight?" The reply came almost immediately. "Of course. Where are you? Do you want me to come get you?" Annie turned toward the window. Rain was streaming down the glass in thick sheets, distorting the garden lights beyond it. She typed, "I can get there myself." Ruth replied, "You don't have to explain anything. Just come. My door is always open to you." Annie pressed the phone against her chest. Her lips tightened. She had not cried while Grant humiliated her in front of his guests. She had not cried when he told her she could work for the rest of her life and still never afford the frame of the painting. Even when he threatened that his lawyers could make her pay for years, Annie had remained standing. But the words, "My door is always open to you," nearly shattered what little strength she had left. If Annie's story touched your heart, please give this video a like and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe everyone deserves kindness, dignity, and a fair chance, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the rest of Annie's story. Maria pretended not to notice Annie's reddened eyes. She simply bent down and lifted the cardboard box. "Ready?" Annie looked around the room. The bed was bare. The desk was empty. The hook behind the door where she had always hung her uniform was now empty too. Months of her life late cleaning shifts. Rushed dinners eaten beside the sink. Nights spent studying until 2 in the morning had all been reduced to one suitcase, one canvas bag, and one cardboard box. "I guess so." Annie pulled the suitcase onto the floor. The broken wheel made it tilt to one side, forcing her to lift one corner as she dragged it. Maria carried the box of books. Together, they walked toward the front of the house. As they passed the ballroom entrance, Annie glanced inside without meaning to. The party was still going. A server had just brought out another tray of champagne. The band had shifted to a softer jazz number. Several guests were laughing as though what had happened in the gallery had been nothing more than an awkward interruption that was already over. Grant stood near the piano speaking with 2 older men. He held a glass of water in one hand, and his face had returned to its usual composed expression. He did not look at Annie. That hurt more than she wanted to admit. Walter stood several feet away from Grant, nodding while an employee reported something to him. Preston Hale remained near the bar, the bourbon in front of him barely touched since the painting had been torn. Preston noticed Annie. "Miss Carter." Annie stopped. He walked toward her. The discomfort on his face was now so obvious that he hardly needed to say anything. "I'm very sorry about what happened." Annie watched him for a moment before asking directly, "Did you tear the painting?" Preston did not answer right away. His eyes instinctively moved toward Walter. That tiny movement was enough. Annie nodded very slowly. You think you did? Preston touched his cuff link. I felt it catch on something. I heard a tearing sound. I can't be 100% certain, but then tell Mr. Whitmore. I tried. Annie looked at him. No, Mr. Hale. You started to tell him. Then Walter interrupted you, and you let him. Those are two different things. Preston lowered his voice. Walter said he saw you standing there, and you know what you felt when your sleeve caught the canvas. Preston did not answer. Annie looked at the man standing in front of her, then at his expensive suit and the gleaming cuff link on his wrist. Only a few hours earlier, none of those things had meant anything to her. Now one cuff link might have cost her her job, her home, and even her chance to go to college. Good night, Mr. Hale. Annie, but she had already turned away. When Annie and Maria reached the front entrance, Walter approached from behind them. Not this way. Annie stopped. What? Staff leave the property through the service entrance. Annie looked through the glass doors. Rain was pouring onto the stone steps outside. The service entrance goes all the way around the back. I'm carrying a suitcase and books. Then you'd better start walking. Maria frowned. Walter, it's pouring outside. Her things are heavy. Walter looked at the cardboard box in Maria's arms and held out his hands. Give it to me. For one brief second, Annie thought he had finally decided to help. Maria thought so too. She handed the box to Walter. Walter took it, walked through the front doors, and went straight to the edge of the covered porch. Then he placed the box down exactly where the rain was blowing in. The cardboard immediately began to darken. Maria stared at him. Walter. Annie rushed forward. What are you doing? Those are my books. Walter turned around, perfectly calm, as though he had simply placed a piece of luggage where it belonged. Then picked them up. Annie quickly bent down and grabbed the box before the rain could soak through the bottom. She dragged it back beneath the covered porch and wiped the drops of water from the textbook lying on top with her bare hand. Do you know how many extra shifts I had to work to buy these books? Walter shrugged. No. And I have no reason to know. Annie stared at him. She said nothing more. She lifted the box, but it was so heavy that it began to slip from her hands. She quickly leaned to one side to catch it. The sudden movement caused the canvas bag on her shoulder to slide down. Its strap caught on the corner of the stone railing and jerked hard. Wait. Rip. The old zipper split open. The bag fell onto the steps. Everything inside spilled out. 2 shirts slid across the wet stone. Her phone charger dropped into a small puddle. The framed photograph of her mother landed face down on the step. Papers from the university caught in the wind and scattered like white birds, while the thick medical folder flew from the bag, struck the edge of a stone step, and burst open. No. Annie quickly set down the box of books and dropped to her knees on the cold stone. She reached for the photograph of her mother first, wiping the water from the glass with her sleeve. Then she stretched out to catch the papers the wind was pulling toward the edge of the steps. Maria knelt down beside her to help. I'll get these. Walter remained standing where he was. Annie bent low, gathering her belongings one by one in the rain. Her hair was already wet, strands sticking to her cheeks. The knees of her gray uniform had darkened from the water covering the stone. A sudden gust of wind swept across the porch. Several pages from the medical folder lifted into the air. Annie caught one. Another sailed over her shoulder, skimmed across the wet stone, and came to rest near the doorway. At that exact moment, a familiar voice came from inside the mansion. What is going on out here? Annie froze. Maria looked up. Walter turned toward the door. Grant Whitmore stood beneath the warm lights of the foyer, staring at the scene in front of him. The rain-soaked cardboard box. Clothes scattered across the stone steps, and Annie kneeling on the cold porch with wet hair clinging to her face, desperately trying to keep the last pieces of her life from being carried away by the storm. And lying directly beside the toe of Grant's shoe was a single sheet of paper the wind had blown from Annie's medical file. Grant stepped onto the covered porch and looked from Walter to Annie, then down at the clothes and papers scattered across the wet stone. What is going on out here? Walter answered before Annie could. She dropped her things, sir. I was trying to get her out of the house as you ordered. Annie pulled a damp notebook from a puddle and held it against her chest. He put my box in the rain. Walter shook his head. Sir, she is delaying again. Every minute she stays here, she finds another reason not to leave. I am picking up my things, Annie said. That is all. Grant glanced toward the open doors behind him. Music still carried from inside, and several guests had begun drifting toward the foyer, curious about the commotion. "Walter, get everyone back inside." "Yes, sir." But Walter did not move immediately. He looked at Annie as if waiting for her to provide another excuse he could use. Annie bent down and reached for a stack of papers near the bottom step. Rain had already soaked through the corners. One page stuck to the stone. She tried to peel it free without tearing it. "Please," she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. Grant noticed the cardboard box beside her. Nursing books filled most of it. One had fallen open in the rain. "You said you were saving for college," he said. Annie did not look up. "I was." Walter gave a faint scoff. "Sir, she has already used that story several times tonight." Annie turned toward him. "It is not a story. You should have thought about your future before making yourself a liability. I did not damage that painting. Here we go again." Annie stood quickly. "Because nobody has listened to me." Walter looked at Grant. "You see what I mean? She keeps circling back because she thinks eventually you will feel sorry for her." Grant's expression hardened. "Annie, I told you to leave." "I know." "Then leave." Her eyes filled, but she forced the tears back. "I am trying to. My things are wet. My bag broke, and I am trying to pick up what I have left." Grant looked toward the driveway where rain beat against the parked cars. "Do you have somewhere to go?" "Yes." The answer came fast enough that he could not tell whether it was true. Walter stepped closer. "Sir, I can have security escort her to the gate." Annie looked at him. "You have done enough. Watch how you speak to me." "You lied about me." Walter's face tightened. "That accusation will not help you." A voice came from behind Grant. "She is right about one thing." Preston Hale had walked out from the foyer. Walter turned. "Mr. Hale, please go back inside. There is no reason for you to get involved." Preston ignored him and looked at Grant. "I told you earlier. My cuff caught something near the painting." Walter stepped between them slightly. "And I explained what I saw." "No," Preston said. "You explained what you wanted Grant to believe." Grant looked at him. "Are you saying you tore it?" Preston rubbed his hand over his jaw. "I am saying I felt my sleeve snag the canvas. I should have said it more clearly when it happened." Annie stopped moving. Walter answered quickly. "Sir, he had been drinking. He does not know exactly what happened." Preston turned toward him. "I know what my arm felt. You were nowhere near the tear after Annie arrived, because you called her over after I stepped away." Walter's voice sharpened. "That is not what happened." Annie looked at Grant. "That is exactly what I have been telling you." Grant said nothing. Her face changed when she realized he still was not ready to believe her. "Even now?" she asked. "He is standing right here telling you what happened, and you still cannot say I might be telling the truth." Walter stepped forward. "Enough. Pick up your things." Annie crouched again and reached for the canvas bag. The torn zipper caught against her sleeve. She tugged once, and the bag tipped over. More papers slid onto the steps. She bent lower to catch them. Her shirt lifted along one side. Grant's eyes moved to a narrow surgical scar near her waist. He frowned. Something about its location pulled his attention away from the argument. Annie quickly pulled her shirt down and reached for the nearest folder. A gust of wind caught several pages before she could close it. One sheet spun across the porch and stopped against Grant's shoe. "I'll get it," Annie said. Grant bent first. The paper was already wet around the edges, but the heading remained clear. "Living kidney donor, post-operative follow-up." Grant's hand stopped. He read the name underneath. Annie Carter, then the date. His breathing changed. He looked at Annie, then back at the page. "What is this?" Annie reached for it. "It is private medical paperwork." Grant did not release it. "Why do you have a living donor follow-up?" Annie's face tightened. "Because I donated a kidney." Walter glanced between them. "Sir, this has nothing to do with tonight." Grant barely seemed to hear him. His eyes had moved lower on the page. Hospital name, surgery date, case code, GVA 614. The color drained from his face. "No," he said. Annie frowned. "What?" Grant turned toward the house without answering and walked quickly inside. Walter called after him. "Sir?" Grant did not stop. Annie remained on the porch, soaked from the rain, holding a torn bag against her side. Preston looked at the paper still in Grant's hand as he disappeared through the doorway. What was on that page? Annie picked up the last of her clothes, something that was never supposed to matter to anyone here. Inside, Grant reached his private study. pulled open a locked drawer, and took out an old hospital file. His hands shook as he searched through the documents until he found the page he wanted. He compared the numbers. 2614. The same code, the same surgery date, the same transplant center. Grant gripped the edge of the desk and looked toward the front doors. Outside, Annie was lifting her damaged suitcase. Grant ran back toward the porch. Annie? Annie? Grant's voice cut through the noise of the rain. Annie had already lifted her suitcase when he hurried down the steps, still holding the medical paper in one hand and his own hospital file in the other. She stopped but did not turn around right away. Walter followed him onto the porch. Sir, whatever you found, we can discuss it inside. Grant ignored him. Annie, please wait. She finally faced him. Rain ran from her hair onto her shoulders. The broken canvas bag hung from one hand, and the cardboard box rested against her leg. What do you want, Mr. Whitmore? Grant raised the two documents. His eyes moved between the matching codes as if he needed to read them again. GW0614. This is the identification code on my transplant record. Annie frowned. I don't know anything about your medical records. The surgery date is the same. That doesn't mean you can keep my paperwork. Grant seemed to realize he was still holding it. He stepped closer and offered the page back. You donated at Street Matthew Transplant Center? Yes. 8 months ago? Yes. To someone you didn't know? Annie took the wet page from him. That was the arrangement. Grant pressed one hand against his side. Preston came out behind Walter, followed by Maria, who remained close to the doorway. Grant swallowed. My transplant was 8 months ago, at Street Matthew. Annie's expression changed slightly. He continued. My file carries that same code. The center used it for anonymous correspondence between the donor and recipient. Walter stepped forward. Sir, there could be hundreds of similar numbers. We shouldn't jump to conclusions because of one sheet of paper. Grant turned on him. The date matches. Walter hesitated. The hospital matches. Grant continued. The code matches. Even so, sir. Stop talking. Walter closed his mouth. Grant looked at Annie again. Did the transplant center ever tell you anything about the person who received your kidney? No name, no address, nothing that could identify him. Did you receive a letter? Annie lowered her eyes toward the papers in her arms. Yes. Grant's breathing grew uneven. What did it say? That the recipient was grateful, that he had another chance at life. Grant's hand tightened around his file. Annie noticed the change in his face. Was that you? He tried to answer, but nothing came out at once. She looked at the hospital file in his hand. Mr. Whitmore? Yes. The single word seemed to cost him effort. Annie stood under the rain without moving. Grant looked at the young woman he had ordered out only minutes earlier. Her books were wet. Her suitcase was damaged. One of her shirts lay partly in a puddle near the bottom step. He had watched all of it happen because he had decided a painting deserved more patience than she did. His knees weakened, and he caught the porch railing before lowering himself onto the step. Preston moved toward him. Grant, are you all right? Grant lifted one hand, asking him not to come closer. Walter tried again. Sir, you're upset. Let me call someone. Grant looked up at him. Not one more word. Walter's face tightened. Annie watched Grant from several feet away. There was no satisfaction in her expression. Grant looked at the medical file in his hand, then at her. You gave me your kidney. I gave a kidney to someone who needed one. That person was me. I understand that now. His voice cracked. And I just called you worthless. Annie looked away. Grant pushed himself back to his feet. I threw you out in the rain. Yes. I threatened your education. Yes. I accused you without proof. Annie finally looked at him again. Yes. Each answer stripped away another excuse. Grant stepped down from the porch. Rain reached the shoulders of his tuxedo almost immediately. Come back inside. Annie shook her head. Please. You wanted me gone. I was wrong. You were wrong before you found that paper. Grant stopped. Annie shifted the box in her arms. That is the part you keep skipping. I'm not skipping it. You believed Mr. Briggs because he has worked for you for years. You believed the painting because it cost $10 million. You believed everything except me. Grant had no answer. Walter moved closer. Annie, Mr. Whitmore has admitted there was a misunderstanding. Take the opportunity and come back inside. She turned toward him. A misunderstanding? I'm trying to help you. You accused me of something you knew I didn't do. Walter's voice became firmer. Be careful. Grant looked at him. Careful about what? Walter paused. Grant stepped between Walter and Annie. She says you knew she didn't damage the painting. Sir, she is upset. So am I. Answer the question. Walter glanced toward Preston. I told you what I witnessed. Preston spoke before Grant could respond. No, Walter. You told him what protected me. Walter's jaw tightened. Mr. Hale, you were drinking. I still know when my cuff catches canvas. Grant turned slowly toward him. Say that again. Preston took a breath. My sleeve caught the painting. I felt it tear. Walter saw it happen. Annie lowered the box to the porch step. Grant looked at Walter. Walter immediately raised both hands. Sir, I was trying to protect the evening. Mr. Hale is an important guest. Reporters were inside. The painting is part of your family collection. I made a judgment call. You made Annie the price of that judgment. I was protecting your reputation. Grant's expression hardened. By lying to me? Walter said nothing. Grant looked at Annie, then at the wet books beside her. She had told him the truth from the beginning. He had not even checked. Walter, Grant said, you're done here. Walter blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. After nearly 20 years? After tonight. Walter's face changed. You're firing me because of her? Grant glanced at Annie. No, I'm firing you because you lied, framed an employee, and expected me to value a wealthy guest more than the truth. Walter looked toward the house as if someone might support him. Nobody did. Grant continued. Turn over your keys to security before you leave. Walter walked inside without another word. Grant then faced Annie again. I'll pay your tuition. Every dollar. Tuition, books, housing, whatever you need. Annie's expression did not brighten. Grant seemed confused by that. She picked up her suitcase. You still think money is the answer? I'm trying to make this right. No, you're trying to make yourself feel better. Grant flinched. Annie lifted the canvas bag onto her shoulder. I didn't give you a kidney so you would owe me. Annie, I deserved respect before you knew I saved your life. Grant stopped walking. Annie picked up her box and turned toward the driveway. This time Grant did not order anyone to block her path. He stood in the rain and watched her leave, carrying everything he had nearly taken from her except the one thing she had refused to surrender. Her dignity. Annie did not look back until Whitmore House had disappeared behind the rain. The rideshare driver helped her fit the cardboard box into the trunk and placed the damaged suitcase beside it. Annie kept the canvas bag on her lap during the drive. The broken zipper would no longer close, so she held both sides together with one hand while the other rested over the folder inside. Her phone vibrated twice. Both calls came from Grant Whitmore. She declined them. A third call arrived a few minutes later. She turned the phone face down. The driver glanced at her through the mirror. You okay back there? Yes, thank you. He did not ask again. By the time they reached Ruth Delaney's house, the rain had weakened. A porch light burned above the front door, and Ruth was already outside before the car stopped. Oh, Annie, I'm okay. Ruth looked at the wet box, the torn bag, and Annie's soaked clothes. You can tell me that after you get inside. She paid the driver before Annie could argue, then took the cardboard box. I can carry it. I know you can. I'm still carrying it. Annie followed her inside. The house smelled of coffee and the vegetable soup Ruth had left warming on the stove. Annie set the suitcase beside the couch. Water dripped from the hem of her clothes onto the floor. Ruth brought her a towel. Bathroom's free. There are dry clothes on the chair. Change before you get sick. Annie started to speak. Not yet, Ruth said. Dry clothes first, soup second, explanations after that. Annie's mouth trembled. Ruth touched her shoulder. Go on. Several minutes later, Annie returned wearing an old sweatshirt and loose pants Ruth kept for her. Her wet hair was wrapped in a towel. Ruth had already spread the damp papers across the dining table, placing paper towels beneath them. Annie stopped when she saw the medical folder. I didn't read anything. I know. Ruth set a bowl of soup in front of her. Annie took 2 bites before her hands began shaking. Ruth sat across from her. Now tell me. Annie stared into the bowl. They said I ruined a painting. Did you? No. Then start there. Annie told her everything in order. Preston standing near the painting. Walter cutting him off. Grant refusing to listen. The threat of a lawsuit. The rain. Her belongings on the steps. Then the medical paper landing at Grant's feet. Ruth's face changed when Annie reached that part. He is the recipient? Annie nodded. Grant Whitmore? Yes. Ruth sat back. And he had no idea? Neither did I. What did he do when he found out? He dropped to the steps like someone had taken the strength out of him. Then he started saying he was sorry. Ruth waited. He offered to pay for college. And? I told him no. Ruth studied her. Because you don't want his money, or because you don't want anything from him. Annie looked down. I don't know. That's fair. He called me someone like me. Annie swallowed. He said I could work my whole life and never afford that painting. He threatened to bury me in court costs. Then he found out about the kidney. And suddenly, I mattered. Ruth's voice softened. That is what hurt. Annie's eyes filled. I kept telling him the truth. I kept asking him to check. He didn't even try. Ruth reached across the table and covered Annie's hand. You don't have to decide tonight whether you forgive him. I don't know if I ever will. You don't have to decide that tonight either. Annie wiped her face quickly. I hate crying over people who think I'm beneath them. Then don't cry for him. Annie looked at her. Cry because you had a terrible night. Cry because someone put your future in danger. Cry because you were treated unfairly. Tears don't belong to the person who caused them. Annie gave a small, tired laugh. Her phone vibrated again. This time it was a message. Mr. Whitmore. I will not call again tonight. Walter has been dismissed. Mr. Hale has admitted responsibility for the painting. I am withdrawing every threat of legal action. You were telling the truth. I should have listened. Annie read it twice. Ruth did not ask to see the screen. He says Walter is gone. Good. Preston admitted it. Also good. Annie kept reading. A second message appeared. I have instructed my attorney and insurer that you are not responsible for the damage. Tomorrow I will provide that in writing. I know this does not repair what I said to you. Annie placed the phone beside her bowl. Ruth asked, does it help? A little. Then let it help a little. You don't owe him more than that. Back at Whitmore House, Grant stood in the gallery while the remaining staff cleared glasses and folding tables from the event. A restoration specialist had covered the painting and asked that no one go near it until morning. Preston remained near the doorway. I'll pay whatever restoration costs are mine, he said. Grant turned toward him. This was never mainly about the restoration. I know. Do you? Preston lowered his eyes. You watched me accuse her. I tried to tell you. You tried until Walter made it uncomfortable. Preston said nothing. Grant continued. Then you stepped away because it was easier. I was embarrassed. Annie was the one being thrown out. Preston rubbed his forehead. You're right. Grant looked toward the front steps through the glass doors. No, Annie was right. The rest of us were just late. Maria approached from the hallway. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? I need to tell you something. Grant faced her fully. Maria hesitated. I saw Mr. Hale near the painting before Annie went into the gallery. I heard the canvas tear. Mr. Briggs called Annie over afterward. Grant's expression tightened. Why didn't you say that earlier? Maria looked toward the floor. Mr. Briggs controlled our shifts. I was afraid he'd make sure I never worked another event here. Grant did not defend himself. Thank you for telling me now. Maria nodded. As she turned to leave, Grant stopped her. Maria, yes, sir? Annie asked me to check the cameras. I heard her. I didn't. Maria looked at him for a moment. No, sir, you didn't. She walked away. Grant remained beside the damaged painting, surrounded by a house that still looked expensive and impressive under the gallery lights. For once, none of it made him feel successful. Across town, Annie finished her soup, folded a dry blanket over the couch, and placed her damaged nursing book beneath a stack of heavy magazines so the wet pages would flatten overnight. She looked at the university email on her phone again. The deadline had not changed. Her job was still gone. Her savings were still short. Grant Whitmore might finally believe her, but Annie knew belief arriving after humiliation did not erase what had happened. Ruth switched off the kitchen light. Try to sleep. Annie nodded. Before setting her phone aside, she read Grant's message one more time. Then she typed 4 words. I need some time. Grant received them almost immediately. He stared at the screen, then wrote back only, I understand. The next morning, Annie woke on Ruth's couch before 7. Her clothes from the night before hung near the laundry room, and several damp pages from her medical folder were spread across the dining table beneath clean towels. Ruth had already made coffee and scrambled eggs. You slept 3 hours, Ruth said. Maybe 4. That is not an improvement. Annie sat down and picked up her phone. There were no new calls from Grant, only an email from Whitmore Holdings marked urgent. She opened it. A signed letter confirmed that she had not damaged the painting, that no civil claim would be filed against her, and that her employment record would show no misconduct. Her final wages would be paid immediately. Annie read the paragraph twice. Ruth placed a plate in front of her. Good news? They cleared my name in writing. That matters. It does. Annie scrolled farther. Grant had also included a short personal message. Annie, I will not ask you to return to work. I understand why that would be unfair. The letter attached is formal confirmation that you were wrongly accused. If any future employer contacts this household, they will be told the truth. Annie stopped there. Ruth sat across from her. What is bothering you? He did what he should have done. Yes, and part of me is relieved. You are allowed to be. Annie set the phone down. But I still lost the job. Ruth nodded. My tuition deadline is getting closer. I was counting on those paychecks. Then we deal with that problem separately. I don't want his money. That is not the same thing as not needing money. Annie picked up her fork but did not eat. Ruth continued. You can refuse guilt money and still accept something fair later. Just make sure you know the difference. Across town, Grant was already at his desk. The gala staff had gone home hours earlier, but the house still showed signs of the event. Empty flower arrangements waited near the service entrance. Folded rental chairs were stacked beside the ballroom. The gallery remained closed while a restoration specialist examined the painting. Grant had spent most of the night reviewing what security had recovered. The main gallery camera had not recorded the incident, but a hallway camera showed enough to make the sequence clear. Preston entered the gallery before Annie. Walter went in seconds later. Annie remained outside, cleaning a side table. Then Walter appeared in the doorway and called her over. That alone should have ended the accusation before it began. Grant watched the footage again. His attorney, Daniel Mercer, sat across the desk. You've already issued the written correction, Daniel said. The insurer has Preston's statement. From a liability standpoint, Annie Carter is cleared. Grant closed the laptop. That isn't enough. Daniel studied him. Legally, it is. I'm not asking legally. Daniel waited. Grant looked toward the window. Walter controlled schedules, references, disciplinary notes, access to this house. Maria told me she was afraid to speak because she thought he could end her work here. That is a management problem. It is my management problem. Daniel nodded once. Then fix it. Grant looked at the employment files stacked on the desk. Review every complaint filed under Walter in the past 5 years. All of them? All of them. You may find nothing. Then we find nothing. But I want someone outside this household reviewing them. Daniel wrote a note. And Grant? What? Do not turn this into a performance. Grant looked at him. If you are doing this because you think Annie will hear about it and forgive you, stop now. Grant's expression tightened. Daniel continued. Do it because Walter had authority under your name. That means every person under him was working under your responsibility. Grant looked down at the desk. I know. No, you are beginning to know. After Daniel left, Grant opened the transplant file again. The anonymous correspondence sheet carried the same code Annie's paperwork had shown. He called Street Matthew Transplant Center, but the coordinator gave him the answer he expected. We cannot confirm donor identity without authorization from the donor. I understand. If Miss Carter wishes to permit contact or disclosure, she can initiate that process herself. Grant closed his eyes for a second. Then I will wait. He ended the call without arguing. That choice felt unfamiliar. By mid-morning, Annie was sitting at Ruth's dining table repairing what she could from the previous night. 2 nursing books had warped from the rain. One could still be used. The other had pages stuck together near the middle. Ruth picked it up. We can replace this. It is $86. I did not ask for the obituary. Annie smiled despite herself. A knock came at the front door. Ruth opened it and returned holding a large envelope. Courrier. Annie's name was printed across the front. Inside were the formal employment documents Grant had emailed, plus a check covering every hour she had worked, including the gala shift. There was no extra money, no tuition check, no expensive gift. Annie noticed that immediately. Ruth did as well. He listened to one thing, at least. Annie found a handwritten note inside. I am not including money you did not earn. You made it clear that would not repair anything. If you are willing, I would like to speak with you in person. Not about returning to work. Not about the kidney. About what I did. Annie read it slowly. Ruth poured more coffee. Do you want to see him? No. Ruth raised an eyebrow. Annie exhaled. Maybe. That sounds more accurate. I don't know what he can say that changes anything. Maybe nothing. Then why meet him? Because sometimes a meeting is not about changing what happened. Sometimes it is about deciding what happens next. Annie folded the note. What if he apologizes and expects me to make him feel better? Then you do not. What if he offers college again? You decide whether the offer respects you or buys his conscience. Annie looked toward the university email still open on her laptop. I hate that everything comes back to money. Ruth sat beside her. No. Everything comes back to choice. Money just makes some choices easier. Annie remained quiet for a while, then reached for her phone. She typed a message to Grant. You can come tomorrow morning. I will hear what you have to say. I am not promising anything else. Grant replied several minutes later. That is more than I have any right to ask for. Thank you. Annie read the message, locked her phone, and returned to the damaged nursing book. Ruth watched her separate 2 wet pages with careful fingers. You know, Ruth said, paper dries. Pages can be replaced. Just make sure nobody convinces you that being hurt means you have to stay broken. Annie looked at the book, then at the formal letter clearing her name. I'm not broken. I know. Annie pressed the page flat beneath her palm. Tomorrow he gets one conversation. Ruth nodded. Then make sure he listens this time. Grant arrived at Ruth Delaney's house shortly before 9 the next morning. He had driven himself and parked along the curb instead of pulling into the driveway. There was no assistant with him, no attorney, no envelope in his hand. Ruth opened the door after the second knock. Mr. Whitmore. Mrs. Delaney. She looked past him toward the street, then back at him. Annie said you could have one conversation. That means you listen when she tells you it is over. I understand. Ruth stepped aside. Annie was sitting at the dining table with her laptop open and several nursing books stacked beside it. One of the books still showed water damage along the bottom edge. Grant noticed it immediately. Annie closed the laptop. You came. You said I could. That does not mean I changed my mind about anything. I know. Ruth poured coffee into a mug and set it near Annie. She did not offer Grant one. I'll be in the kitchen, she said. Door stays open. Grant nodded. He sat across from Annie. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Grant had spent the drive preparing sentences, yet looking at Annie made most of them sound useless. She finally said, You wanted to talk. Yes. Then talk. Grant folded his hands on the table. Walter lied to me. Preston confirmed he caused the damage. Maria confirmed you were outside the gallery before Walter called you in. Security footage supports that. I already know I did not damage the painting. You're right. Annie waited. Grant exhaled. I'm not here to explain, Walter. Good. I'm here to explain myself. Her expression did not soften. I trusted him because he worked for me for 20 years. I trusted Preston because he was a business partner. I looked at you and decided their position made their words stronger than yours. Annie's fingers moved around the coffee mug. Grant continued. I could say I was angry. I could say the painting had financial and family value. I could say I was embarrassed in front of my guests. All of that would be true, and none of it would make what I did right. Annie looked at him. You called me someone like you. What did you mean? Grant did not answer immediately. Say it, Annie said. He looked down at the table. I meant someone I thought had less standing than the people around you. That sounds cleaner than what you actually meant. It does. What did you actually mean? Grant forced himself to meet her eyes. I saw a young black woman in a cleaning uniform, working in my house. And I decided your life gave me less reason to trust you. Annie swallowed. Grant continued before she could speak. I hate admitting that. You should. I know. Annie's voice lowered. You know what kept going through my head that night? Grant waited. I was not asking you to give me anything. I was asking you to check what happened. That was all. I told you where I had been. I told you Walter called me into the gallery. I asked you to check the cameras. You would not even do that. Grant's face tightened. I know. No, you know now. That night you did not want to know. He had no defense for that. Annie looked at the damaged book beside her laptop. You told me the painting was worth more than I could earn in my whole life. I remember. Do you understand what that sounded like? Yes. I don't think you do. Grant waited. It sounded like you were telling me the painting had more value than my future. You threatened to sue me until college disappeared. You sent my things into the rain. Then you found a medical paper. And suddenly I was worth listening to. Grant's eyes dropped. Annie continued, if that paper had never fallen out of my bag, would you be sitting here? No. The answer came without hesitation. Annie's face changed. The honesty hurt more than an excuse would have. Grant saw it. I wish the answer were different. But it isn't. No. Ruth remained near the kitchen doorway, listening without interrupting. Grant said, the kidney made me understand who you were to me. But it also forced me to see what I had done before I knew. Those are separate things. Annie nodded once. They are. You saved my life, but that is not why you deserved fairness. Then why did you need the kidney to learn that? Grant looked at her. I don't have a good answer. That is the problem. Yes. Annie picked up her mug, then set it down again without drinking. Grant said, I want to apologize for accusing you, for humiliating you in front of everyone, for threatening your education, for letting Walter put your things outside, for the way I spoke to you from the day you started working in my house. Annie looked toward the window. I accept that you said it. Grant understood the difference. I'm not asking you to forgive me. Good. I am asking what I can repair. Annie gave a small shake of her head. You still want a list. A list? Things you can fix. Things you can pay for. Things you can sign. Grant stopped himself before responding. Annie continued. You sent the letter clearing my name. That mattered. You paid what I earned. That mattered. But the rest is not a bill. Ruth spoke from the doorway. Mr. Whitmore, there's a difference between charity and restitution. Grant turned toward her. What difference? Charity asks what you can give. Restitution asks what was taken. Grant looked back at Annie. What did I take? Mid-job. He nodded. My housing. Another nod. My sense that if I worked hard and told the truth, that would count for something. Grant's expression tightened. And for one night, Annie added, you made me wonder whether people like you would always believe people like Walter before they believed me. Grant said, I cannot undo that. No. But I can make sure your record stays clear. I can make sure Walter cannot interfere with your references. I can make sure every employee in that house knows what actually happened. That would be fair. I will do it. Annie hesitated, then said, and do not tell anyone about the kidney. Grant nodded immediately. I won't. That is my medical history. I understand. If the transplant center needs my permission to confirm anything, they can contact me. You do not get to call around until somebody gives you what you want. Grant accepted the correction. All right. He stood. Annie looked surprised. That's it? You said one conversation. A faint change touched her face. Grant pushed the chair in. At least you listened this time, she said. He paused near the door. I should have done that before I knew your name meant something to me. Annie answered. My name meant something before you knew it. Grant nodded. You're right. He left without asking about tuition. After the door closed, Ruth returned to the table and sat across from Annie. You all right? Annie looked at the nursing book with the warped pages. No. Ruth waited. But I think I will be. Her phone buzzed a few minutes later. A message from Street Matthew Transplant Center appeared on the screen. They were asking whether Annie wished to authorize contact regarding the recipient of her kidney. Annie read it once, then placed the phone beside her coffee. This decision, at least, would be hers. Annie left the message from Street Matthew unanswered for almost an hour. Ruth did not push her. She cleared the breakfast dishes, watered 2 plants near the kitchen window, and gave Annie enough space to decide without turning the decision into a test. Finally, Annie picked up her phone again. The transplant center had written that Grant Whitmore had requested permission to establish direct contact through the proper process. They would not release additional information unless Annie agreed. She read the message twice, then typed a short reply. I authorize confirmation that I was the living donor connected to case GW0614. I do not authorize release of any other medical information. She stopped before sending it. Ruth noticed. You don't have to do that today. I know. Then why are you? Annie looked at the screen. Because I don't want him wondering if the papers were a coincidence. I want him to know the truth. And after that? He lives with it. Ruth nodded. That sounds like your decision. Annie pressed send. Across Charleston, Grant was meeting with Daniel Mercer, and the outside human resources consultant Daniel had recommended. 3 folders sat on Grant's desk, each containing complaints connected to Walter Briggs. One described an employee whose weekend hours had been cut after she questioned a schedule change. Another mentioned Walter making remarks about a worker's accent. A third complaint had been withdrawn 2 days after it was filed. Grant turned the last page. Why was this withdrawn? The consultant, Evelyn Shaw, answered. The employee wrote that the matter had been resolved. Was it? There is no documentation showing how. Daniel leaned forward. Walter controlled the household records himself. Grant closed the folder. So the man being complained about was also controlling what happened to the complaint. Yes, Evelyn said. Grant rubbed his thumb along the edge of the file. Change it. Evelyn waited. Every household employee gets a way to report concerns outside the estate manager. No retaliation. No one person controls scheduling, discipline, references, and complaints. That can be arranged, and I want the staff paid for the time they spend in these meetings. Daniel gave him a brief look. Good. Grant did not respond. His phone rang. Street Matthew Transplant Center. He answered immediately. Mr. Whitmore, this is Laura Bennett with Donor Services. I'm calling regarding case GW0614. Grant stood without realizing it. Yes, the donor has authorized us to confirm that Annie Carter was the living donor associated with your transplant. Grant closed his eyes. Even though he had already known, hearing it from the center made the truth final in a different way. Thank you. She has not authorized release of any additional medical information. You won't get any request from me. There was a brief pause. Understood. Grant ended the call. Daniel watched him. It's confirmed? Grant nodded. Evelyn looked between them but did not ask. Grant walked to the window and pressed one hand against his side. Annie had entered an operating room for a stranger. Months later, that stranger had told her she could not afford even a corner of a painting. Daniel broke the silence. What are you going to do? Grant turned. Nothing with that information unless Annie asks me to. Daniel nodded. That's probably the right answer. Grant looked back at the complaint files. And with these? Those are different. Yes. He returned to the desk. Start with everyone Walter supervised in the last 3 years. Current employees and former employees. I want them contacted by someone who does not work for me directly. Evelyn wrote it down. Grant continued, and make it clear their future work will not be affected by what they say. Daniel said, you understand some of what comes back may be uncomfortable. Grant gave him a tired look. I think we passed comfortable 2 nights ago. At Ruth's house, Annie was trying to salvage the nursing textbook that had taken the worst of the rain. Several pages had dried together. She worked them apart with the corner of a clean sheet of paper. Ruth came in carrying 2 grocery bags. You are still fighting with that book? It cost $86. So you have mentioned. It was $86 before it turned into a brick. Ruth set the bags on the counter. I bought peaches. That changes nothing. It changes breakfast tomorrow. Annie smiled. Her phone rang. She recognized the number from Street Matthew. Hello? Miss Carter, this is Laura Bennett from Donor Services. We received your authorization. We have confirmed your donor status with the recipient, limited to the information you approved. Okay. We also wanted to remind you that if you prefer no further contact, you can tell us at any time. I understand. And if you choose direct communication later, that remains your decision. Thank you. After the call ended, Annie set the phone down. Ruth asked, Done? Yes. How do you feel? Annie considered the question. Strange. That is allowed. I spent months wondering whether the person was okay. And now? Now I know he's alive. Ruth leaned against the counter. And? Annie looked at the damaged textbook. And I know exactly what kind of man he can be. Ruth did not correct her. Annie picked up one of the loose pages. I don't regret donating. I didn't think you did. I'm angry with him. But I don't regret it. Those things can exist together. Annie nodded. Later that afternoon, Grant sent one message. Street Matthew confirmed what you authorized them to confirm. I will not ask for anything more. Thank you. Annie read it and did not answer. 5 minutes later, another message appeared, this one from the university financial office. Her remaining tuition balance was still due by Friday. Annie felt the pressure return at once. The truth about Grant had changed many things, but it had not changed the number on that screen. Ruth came over when she saw Annie's face. "How much time?" "5 days." "How much are you short?" Annie told her. Ruth sat beside her. "We'll figure out what choices you have. I don't want to lose another semester." "You won't decide that today." Annie looked at the university email. "I worked for months for this." "I know. And now one lie nearly wiped it out." Ruth rested a hand on the table. "Then make sure the lie doesn't get the final word." That evening, Annie opened her scholarship portal and began searching again. Community grants, nursing awards, emergency tuition funds, anything with a deadline still open. At Whitmore House, Grant stood before the damaged painting while the restoration team examined the tier. One specialist said, "It can be repaired." Grant looked at the canvas. "How long?" "A few months, depending on what we find underneath." Grant nodded. For the painting, there was a plan. For Annie, there was no specialist he could hire, no invoice he could pay, no repair schedule he could approve. He finally understood that the harder work had only started. By Monday morning, Annie had applied for 3 emergency grants and 2 nursing scholarships. None of them could promise an answer before Friday. She sat at Ruth's dining table with her laptop open, moving between application forms and the university billing page. Every time she refreshed the account, the same balance appeared. Ruth placed a cup of coffee beside her. "You have been at that since sunrise." "I'm almost done with another application." "You said that an hour ago." "This one needs a personal statement." "Then write it after breakfast." Annie kept typing. Ruth reached over and closed the laptop halfway. Annie looked up. "Miss Ruth, you are not going to become a nurse by passing out over an empty stomach." "I'm not passing out." "Good. Keep it that way." Annie finally picked up the toast beside her. Her phone rang before she finished the first bite. "Maria Santos." Annie hesitated, then answered. "Hey, Annie, I hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "No. What happened?" "Nothing bad. I just wanted you to know Mr. Whitmore brought in an outside investigator this morning." Annie lowered the toast. "For Walter?" "For everything. Schedules, complaints, what happened at the gala. They interviewed me again." "Did he sit in?" "Mr. Whitmore?" "No. He told the investigator he didn't want employees changing their answers because he was there." That surprised Annie. Maria continued. "They found another camera angle." "What does it show?" "Not the painting itself. It shows Mr. Hale going into the gallery before you. Then it shows you outside cleaning the side table. Walter comes out, looks toward you, and calls you inside after the tier." Annie closed her eyes briefly. "So there's proof. There's enough to show Walter lied about where you were." Annie looked at the university page on her screen. "I already knew that." "I know. I thought hearing that someone else can prove it might matter." "It does." Maria hesitated. "There's something else." "What?" "Walter called me last night." Annie sat straighter. "Why?" "He said I should remember who helped me get work at Whitmore House." "What did you say?" "Nothing. I ended the call." "Maria, you should tell the investigator." "I did." Annie released the breath she had been holding. "Good. I was afraid you'd think I was weak for not speaking sooner." Annie looked toward Ruth, who was sorting mail at the counter. "I don't. I watched what happened to you. I knew Walter could do the same thing to me. That doesn't make you weak." Maria was quiet for a moment. "Thank you." After the call, Annie set the phone down. Ruth asked, "More evidence?" "Yes. Does that help?" "A little. That seems to be happening often lately." Annie gave her a tired smile. At Whitmore House, Evelyn Shaw sat across from Grant with a timeline spread across the desk. Daniel Mercer had joined by video call. Evelyn pointed to a printed image. At 8:41, Preston Hale enters the gallery. At 8:43, Maria Santos passes the doorway. At 8:44, there is a sudden movement from Mr. Hale near the painting. We cannot see the canvas, but his reaction is visible. Walter enters seconds later. Grant looked at the next image. At 8:46, Annie is still outside. "Yes." And Walter calls her in at 8:47. "Yes." Grant's jaw tightened. Evelyn continued. "We also have Mr. Hale's written statement accepting responsibility for the accidental damage." Daniel spoke from the screen. "The insurer has received it." Grant looked at the statement. Preston had written that his cuff caught the canvas while he turned during a conversation. He also admitted Walter told him to return to the ballroom and said he would handle the matter. Grant, read the final paragraph twice. Annie Carter was not present when I damaged the painting and had no involvement in causing the tear. Grant placed the statement down. She should have had this before I fired her. Evelyn replied, you didn't investigate before firing her. I'm aware. I'm saying it because this review cannot become a way of proving Walter was the only problem. Grant looked at her. She continued, Walter abused authority. But the household structure made that authority possible. Staff members believed his word would carry more weight than theirs. On the night of the gala, that belief was correct. Grant did not argue. What do we change? Start with reporting lines. No single household manager should control schedules, discipline, references, and complaints. Staff need a separate contact for workplace concerns. Do it. There also needs to be a written anti-retaliation policy. Do it. And employees need to know these changes are not temporary. Grant looked toward the gallery through the open study door. They won't be. Evelyn gathered the papers. Mr. Whitmore, one more thing. Maria reported Walter contacted her last night. Grant's attention returned to her. What did he say? He reminded her that he had helped her get work here. She understood it as pressure. Can he interfere with her shifts now? No. I've already removed him from every scheduling system. Good. Grant picked up Preston's statement. Send Annie a copy. Daniel spoke again. Have counsel send it formally. No. Send the formal copy through counsel. But I want Annie to receive a simple message from me as well. Evelyn waited while Grant wrote it. We now have video timestamps and Preston Hale's signed statement confirming you were not present when the painting was damaged. Walter called you into the gallery afterward. I am sending you the formal documents. You should never have needed them to be believed. He read the message once before sending it. At Ruth's house, Annie's phone vibrated. She opened Grant's message, then the attached copy of Preston's statement. Her eyes stopped at the sentence clearing her name. Ruth came over. That it? Annie handed her the phone. Ruth read the paragraph and gave it back. Keep that. I will. Not because you need paper to know you told the truth. I know. Keep it because other people may ask. Annie downloaded the statement into a folder beside the employment letter Grant had already sent. Then another email arrived. This one came from the university. Annie opened it and felt her stomach tighten. Her request for an emergency tuition extension had been denied. The original Friday deadline remained in place. Ruth saw the change in her face. What happened? They denied the extension. How much are you still short? Annie told her again. Ruth sat beside her. We have 4 days. Annie looked at the number on the screen. Grant had finally given her proof that her past was clean. Now she had to find a way to protect her future without letting his guilt purchase it. Annie spent Tuesday morning making calls she had hoped she would never need to make. The university financial office transferred her twice before a woman named Denise answered. I understand the deadline, Denise said, but without additional aid posted to the account, I can't promise your enrollment will remain active after Friday. What if I can show that I lost my job because of a wrongful accusation? That could support an emergency review, but the committee would still need documentation. I have documentation. Send everything today. Employment correction, final wage statement, any written proof that you were cleared. Annie looked at the folder Grant's attorney had sent. I can do that. And Annie? Yes? Include a short statement explaining what changed financially. Keep it factual. Thank you. She ended the call and opened a new document. Ruth placed a bowl of oatmeal beside the laptop. You got somewhere? Maybe. That is better than no. Annie began typing, then stopped. How do I explain this without sounding like I'm asking them to feel sorry for me? Tell them what happened. That is asking for sympathy. No, sympathy is somebody's reaction. Facts are facts. Annie looked at the blank page again. Ruth pulled out a chair. Write that you were employed. You were falsely accused. The accusation was withdrawn, and you lost the income you expected to use for school. Do not decorate it. Do not shrink it. Annie nodded and started again. By noon, the packet was ready. She attached Grant's written correction, Preston's statement, her final pay record, and the university's original admission notice. One item was still missing, a formal employment verification showing the dates she had lived and worked at Whitmore House. Annie hesitated before texting Grant. I need an employment verification letter for a university emergency aid review. Dates worked, wages, and confirmation that I was dismissed because of an accusation that was later proven false. Nothing about the transplant. His reply came 5 minutes later. Understood. I'll have it prepared today. You will review the wording before it is sent anywhere. Annie read that last sentence twice. No assumptions, no contacting the school behind her back. She wrote back, "Thank you." At Whitmore House, Grant handed the request to Daniel Mercer. Exactly what she asked for. Daniel read the message. No extra explanation? No. No offer to call the university? Grant shook his head. Daniel looked at him for a moment. "You're learning." Grant did not smile. "I'm trying not to make the same mistake in a different suit." Daniel drafted the letter while Grant reviewed a separate report from Evelyn Shaw. Walter had been removed from all household systems, but the investigation had uncovered a wider pattern. Several workers had described being pressured to accept schedule changes without notice. One former employee said Walter threatened a poor reference after she questioned unpaid extra hours. Grant closed the report. "How much of this reaches me?" Evelyn answered, "If you mean how much personal legal exposure you have, Daniel can answer that." "I mean how much responsibility." Evelyn paused. "More than zero." Grant nodded. "Fair. You gave Walter wide authority." "I did. And you rarely asked what happened below him as long as the house ran well." Grant looked toward the window. "That sounds accurate." Evelyn slid another page across the desk. "I recommend a written grievance process, outside review for disciplinary action, published break schedules, and a rule that references cannot be used as leverage. Put it in place. I also recommend back pay review where timekeeping complaints have support. Do that." Evelyn gathered the documents. Grant stopped her. "One more thing. I want a scholarship created." She glanced up. "Not for Annie." "Then for whom?" "For household employees, service workers, and applicants from foster care backgrounds who are trying to continue school while working." Evelyn studied him. "You realize people will assume this is because of Annie." "It is because of Annie. That does not mean she should automatically receive it." "I agree." Evelyn's expression shifted. Grant continued, "I want an outside committee. Published criteria. No Whitmore employee gets to choose her because I say so." Daniel, still seated near the desk, said, "That makes it slower." "It should." Grant looked at Annie's employment verification on the screen. "I spent years thinking speed was proof of competence. That night I made the fastest decision in the house." Daniel said, "And the worst." "Yes." By mid-afternoon, Annie received the draft letter. She read every line. Grant Whitmore confirmed that Annie Carter had worked as a live-in cleaning employee at Whitmore House, listed the dates, hourly rate, and housing arrangement, then stated that her employment had been terminated following an accusation involving damaged artwork. The accusation was later determined to be false. She had committed no misconduct. Nothing more. Annie sent one correction. "Please change misunderstanding to false accusation." It was not a misunderstanding. Grant replied, "Changed." A revised copy arrived 10 minutes later. Ruth read it over Annie's shoulder. "He did not argue?" "No." That must have hurt him. Annie gave her a look. Ruth smiled. "I am allowed one joke." Annie attached the letter to her emergency aid packet and submitted everything. The confirmation email arrived moments later. "Your request is under expedited review." She let out a breath and closed the laptop. For the rest of the afternoon, there was nothing she could do except wait. At 5:30, Grant called. Annie considered declining, then answered. "Hello? I wanted to tell you the verification letter has been saved in your personnel file exactly as you approved it." "Okay. And I'm not calling about tuition." Annie said nothing. Grant continued. "I've started an education fund for workers who are trying to stay in school while employed. Independent committee. Written criteria." Her shoulders tightened. "Is this another way to give me money?" "No." "You expect me to believe you started a scholarship 3 days after throwing me out?" "Yes. At least you're honest. I started it because what happened to you showed me a problem I should have seen earlier. Whether you ever apply is your decision." Annie walked toward Ruth's front window. "And if I never do? Then someone else uses it." That answer made her stop. Grant added, "I'm not putting your name on it." "Good. I thought you'd say that." A small pause followed. Annie asked, "Why tell me now?" "Because I don't want you hearing about it later and thinking I used your story without asking." She looked down at the phone. "Thank you for asking. I should have done more of that." After the call, Annie returned to the table. Ruth was sorting coupons from the newspaper. "What did he want?" "He started a scholarship." Ruth looked up. For me, apparently not. That sounds different. It is. Ruth folded the paper. Different does not mean forgiven. I know. Different just means different. Annie sat beside her. At 6:12, her laptop chimed. An email from the university financial office. Annie opened it and read the first line. Her emergency aid appeal had been approved for partial funding. She covered her mouth with one hand. Ruth stood immediately. What? They approved some of it. How much? Annie showed her. It was not enough to clear the entire balance, but it cut the amount nearly in half. Ruth hugged her before Annie could say anything. We have 3 days, Ruth said. Annie looked at the remaining number. For once, it no longer looked impossible. The partial aid left Annie with a balance she could almost imagine paying. Almost. She spent the evening reviewing every dollar she had saved. The final paycheck from Whitmore House helped. The emergency grant helped more. Even after adding both, she was still short by an amount that would have seemed small to Grant Whitmore and enormous to someone counting grocery money. Ruth sat across from her with a legal pad. How much? Annie told her. Ruth wrote the number down. That's not the mountain you had yesterday. It's still a mountain when Friday is 2 days away. Then we stop looking at the mountain and find the next foothold. Annie rubbed her forehead. I already applied everywhere I qualify. Everywhere? Every scholarship portal I could find. What about a payment plan? The school requires a deposit before they'll approve one. How much? Annie checked. Ruth pointed at the screen. You can cover that. And then I have monthly payments without a job. So now we need the job. Annie looked at her. Ruth reached for her phone. No, I haven't done anything. You have that look. What look? The one that means you're about to call someone. Ruth smiled and opened her contacts. I know a woman named Patricia Ellis who manages staffing at Harbor Ridge Senior Living. She mentioned last month they needed evening housekeeping staff. I'm going into nursing. I need something that works around classes, which is why evening hours might work. Annie hesitated. And before you start, Ruth added, I am not asking her to hire you. I am asking whether the position still exists. That's different. I know. Ruth made the call. 20 minutes later, Annie had an interview scheduled for Thursday morning. She looked at the appointment confirmation on her phone. That happened fast. Ruth folded her legal pad. Sometimes the answer isn't somebody paying your way. Sometimes it's somebody telling you where the next door is. At Whitmore House, Grant stood in the service dining area with every current household employee gathered around the long table. Evelyn Shaw remained near the doorway with a folder in her hand. Maria sat near the end, still wearing the black work shirt she used for private events. Grant had asked everyone to come during paid hours. He did not stand behind a podium. There are 2 things I need to tell you, he began. One is about Annie Carter. The other is about this house. Several employees exchanged looks. Grant continued. Annie did not damage the painting. Preston Hale has admitted that he caused the tear by accident. Security records confirm Annie was outside the gallery before Walter Briggs called her inside. Maria watched him carefully. Grant drew a breath. I accused Annie before I checked any of that. No one interrupted. I trusted Walter's position. I trusted my own assumptions. I fired her in front of guests, threatened legal action, and allowed her possessions to be taken outside in the rain. A housekeeper named Denise lowered her eyes. Grant did not soften what came next. Walter lied, but I made the decision. Evelyn watched the employees rather than Grant. He continued. Annie's employment record has been corrected. She has received written confirmation that she committed no misconduct. There will be no legal claim against her. One of the maintenance workers raised his hand slightly. Grant nodded. Go ahead. Sir, is Walter coming back? No. Who handles schedules now? For the moment, Evelyn's team. After that, responsibilities will be divided. No single manager will control scheduling, complaints, discipline, and references. Maria spoke next. What happens if someone reports a manager? The report goes outside the household chain of command. And if that manager cuts their hours, they'll have an independent way to report retaliation. Maria nodded. Grant looked around the table. That should have existed already. After the meeting, Maria remained behind. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? May I tell Annie what you said? Grant considered it. If she wants to hear it. Maria gave a small nod. I think she will. Grant stopped her before she left. Maria, when Walter pressured you after the gala, did you think I would protect your job if you spoke against him? She hesitated. No, sir. Grant accepted the answer. Thank you. You asked. That doesn't make it easy to hear. Maria left. Later that afternoon, Annie received her message. Mr. Whitmore told everyone what really happened. He didn't blame Walter for his own decision. He said he was wrong in front of the whole staff. Annie read the message while sitting on Ruth's porch with her interview paperwork. She answered, "Thank you for telling me." Maria replied, "I thought you should know." Annie put the phone down. Ruth came outside carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. What happened? He told the staff. About the painting? And what he did. Ruth handed her a glass. How does that feel? Annie thought about it. Better than a private apology. It should. He humiliated me in front of people. I guess part of me wanted the truth said in front of people as well. That isn't revenge. I know. That's restoring your name. Annie took a drink. Her phone rang. The university financial office appeared on the screen again. She answered immediately. Hello? Annie, this is Denise from Financial Services. I'm calling about your emergency aid review. Annie sat straighter. Yes? The committee reviewed the additional employment documentation you submitted. They approved a small supplemental grant. Annie gripped the phone. How small? Denise told her. Annie quickly opened the calculator on her laptop. Between the 2 grants, her savings, and the final paycheck, she now had enough to make the required deposit and enter the university's monthly payment plan. Are you still there? Denise asked. Yes, I'm sorry, I'm here. If you submit the deposit by tomorrow afternoon, your fall enrollment will remain active. Annie covered her mouth. Thank you. You did the work. Make sure you finish the payment plan form. I will. When the call ended, Ruth was already watching Annie's face. I can stay enrolled. Ruth set down her glass and reached for her. Annie laughed as Ruth wrapped both arms around her. I still have to make the monthly payments. You have an interview tomorrow. I might not get it. Then you apply somewhere else. Annie wiped her eyes. Ruth pointed toward the laptop. Pay the deposit before you celebrate yourself into forgetting. Annie opened the university portal and entered the payment information. When the confirmation appeared, she read it several times. Fall enrollment confirmed. She saved a screenshot. Across Charleston, Grant received no message about it. Annie did not feel obligated to tell him, and Grant did not ask. That mattered. Her future had not been purchased by his guilt. It had survived through documentation, emergency aid, savings, Ruth's guidance, and Annie's refusal to stop searching for another way forward. The next morning, she dressed for her interview at Harbor Ridge and placed her nursing school acceptance letter inside a folder. Ruth looked her over near the front door. Ready? Annie adjusted the strap of her bag. I need a job. That wasn't what I asked. Annie smiled. Yes, I'm ready. This time, when she stepped outside carrying her future in a worn canvas bag, nobody was ordering her to leave. Harbor Ridge Senior Living sat on a quiet street lined with oaks and brick buildings. Annie arrived 15 minutes before her interview, carrying the same canvas bag she had repaired with safety pins and a strip of black thread. She checked her reflection in the glass entrance, smoothed the front of her blouse, then walked inside. Patricia Ellis met her near the reception desk. You must be Annie Carter. Yes, ma'am. Thank you for seeing me. Patricia smiled. Ruth Delaney has been telling me for years that I work people harder than I admit, so I figured I should meet anyone she recommends. Annie almost smiled. That sounds like Miss Ruth. They walked into a small office. Patricia reviewed Annie's application and employment history. You were at Whitmore House until this week? Yes. That ended suddenly. Annie had prepared for the question. I was accused of damaging property during an event. The accusation was proven false, and my employment record has been corrected. Patricia looked up. You brought documentation? Annie handed her Grant's letter and Preston Hale's signed statement. Patricia read both without rushing. Why didn't you return after they cleared you? Annie folded her hands in her lap. Because being proven innocent didn't make it a place where I wanted to keep working. Patricia set the papers down. That's a fair answer. She asked about cleaning schedules, infection control procedures, laundry routines, and working around people who needed privacy and respect. Annie answered carefully, drawing on what she had learned from previous jobs. Then Patricia noticed the university folder. You're starting nursing school? Yes, ma'am. When? Fall semester. And you need evenings. If possible, I can work weekends as well. Patricia checked a schedule. We have a 4 to 10 shift, 3 evenings a week, and 1 Saturday rotation. It won't make you rich. I'm not looking for rich. What are you looking for? A way to stay in school without missing my payments. Patricia smiled slightly. That answer I understand. She closed the folder. I can offer you the position on a 90-day introductory period. Annie blinked. Today? Unless you plan to argue me out of it. No, Mo. Good. Human Resources will send the paperwork this afternoon. Annie felt something loosen inside her chest. Thank you. Thank yourself for showing up prepared. Ruth only got you through the door. When Annie stepped outside, she called Ruth before reaching the sidewalk. Ruth answered on the second ring. Well, I got it. I knew it. You absolutely did not. I had strong suspicions. Annie laughed. 3 evenings a week, Saturdays, and they'll work around my class schedule. Then come home. I bought chicken, and I intend to celebrate. With what money? With grocery money. We are not opening champagne over a housekeeping job. Good. And Annie? Yes? I'm proud of you. Annie stopped beside the bus shelter. Thank you. She ended the call and stood there for a moment, letting herself enjoy one piece of good news without immediately searching for the next problem. Later that afternoon, Grant received Evelyn Shaw's final report on Walter Briggs. The document confirmed what the interviews had already suggested. Walter had used schedules and references to pressure employees. Several workers described being spoken to differently depending on their position, race, or connection to wealthy guests. None of the complaints had reached Grant in a meaningful form. Evelyn placed the report on his desk. You asked for the full picture. Grant turned a page. I should have asked years ago. Yes. He accepted that without argument. What happens next? New reporting system begins Monday. Supervisors get training. Schedules are posted in advance. References require HR approval. Complaints go through an outside channel. And the employees Walter pressured? We review each case individually. Grant closed the report. What about the education fund? The board can approve it this week if you accept one condition. What condition? You do not select recipients. Grant nodded. Agreed. And Annie Carter is not automatically included. Agreed. Evelyn watched him for a moment. You really mean that? She told me she didn't want my guilt paying her tuition. That sounds like her. Grant looked toward the gallery. The damaged painting had already been removed for restoration, leaving an empty section of wall behind. Has anyone heard whether she stayed enrolled? Evelyn shook her head. You told us not to contact her school. I know. Grant picked up his phone, then set it down again. He wanted to ask Annie. He also knew that wanting information did not give him a right to it. That evening, Annie sat at Ruth's kitchen table completing employment forms for Harbor Ridge. Direct deposit. Tax, withholding. Emergency contact. Work availability. When she reached the section asking whether she was enrolled in school, she checked yes. Ruth placed a plate of roasted chicken and green beans beside her. Eat before the food gets cold. I have 2 pages left. You had 2 pages left 10 minutes ago. Annie smiled and set down the pen. Her phone buzzed. It was Grant. She hesitated before opening the message. I wanted to let you know the investigation into Walter is complete. Several employees came forward. New protections are being put in place. I am not contacting you to ask for anything. I thought you deserved to know your experience was not dismissed after you left. Annie read it once more. Then she typed, "Thank you for telling me." She nearly stopped there, but after a moment added, "I found another job today. I'm staying enrolled." Grant received the message while sitting alone at his desk. He read the last sentence twice. A smile crossed his face, followed by something heavier. He wrote, "I'm glad. You earned that future before I ever knew what you did for me." Annie looked at the reply. This time, she did not feel the need to correct him. Ruth glanced over from the stove. "Whitmore?" "Yes." "What did he say?" Annie put the phone down. "Something better than money." Ruth set another spoonful of green beans on her plate. "Good. Now eat something better than email." Annie laughed and picked up her fork. For the next hour, there were no paintings, no accusations, no legal letters, and no hospital records on the table. There was dinner, a new job, a confirmed place at school, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that one cruel night had not decided what came after it. 3 weeks later, Annie stood at the employee entrance of Harbor Ridge wearing navy work pants, a gray polo, and a badge clipped near her shoulder. Her university orientation had ended that afternoon, and this was her second week working the evening shift. Patricia Ellis met her beside the housekeeping cart. Class schedule settled? For now. For now is the most honest answer any college student can give. Annie smiled and checked the supply list. Patricia handed her a revised work schedule. I moved your Thursday shift 30 minutes later. You said your lab runs until 3. You didn't have to do that. I did if I want you arriving here on time instead of running across Charleston. Annie looked at the paper. Thank you. Don't thank me by skipping dinner before work. You sound like Miss Ruth. I'm older than you. We all sound alike eventually. Annie laughed and pushed the cart toward the east hallway. The work itself was familiar. Clean surfaces, replace linens, collect laundry, empty waste bins, keep common areas ready for the next morning. What felt different was the way instructions were given. Patricia corrected mistakes without humiliating anyone. Schedule changes were written down. Employees knew who to contact if they disagreed with a supervisor. Near 7, Annie checked her phone during break. An email from the university announced a new scholarship funded through an independent charitable trust. The program was open to working students with financial need, including applicants who had spent time in foster care. Annie read the eligibility section again. There was no photograph of Grant, no mention of her, no story about the kidney, only the name of the fund, application requirements, deadlines, and a statement that recipients would be selected by an outside committee. Maria had already sent her a message. Did you see the new scholarship? Annie typed back. Just now. You applying? Annie hesitated. I don't know. Maria answered almost immediately. You told me once you wanted people to judge you by the same rules as everyone else. These look like the same rules. Annie smiled despite herself. When she returned home after 10, Ruth was at the kitchen table sorting mail. You saw it, Ruth said before Annie removed her shoes. How do you know? You have the face you make when you are arguing with yourself. I have a face for that? You have several. Annie placed her bag on a chair. The scholarship opened today. I know. You knew before me? I read community newsletters. Some of us still use email for something besides bills. Annie sat across from her. If I apply, people will say Grant created it because of me. Did he? Partly. Does the committee know him personally? The notice says independent selection. Can Grant order them to choose you? No. Do you meet the qualifications? Yes. Ruth spread her hands. Then what exactly are we debating? Annie looked down at the application requirements. I don't want to feel like I took his money after everything I said. Ruth shook her head. You told him you did not want guilt buying your future. That is different from applying for a scholarship available to other people. It still came from him. So, does the electricity in half the buildings downtown come from companies owned by people you would never invite to dinner? We are discussing structure, not friendship. Annie laughed. Ruth continued. If the rules are fair, apply. If they are not fair, don't. Annie opened her laptop. Essay question. Describe a challenge that influenced the way you define service. Ruth stood. That one should not be difficult. I'm not writing about the kidney. Nobody said you should. I'm not writing about Mr. Whitmore either. Then write about the kind of nurse you want to become. Annie looked at the blank page. That I can do. Across town, Grant sat with Evelyn Shaw in his study while she reviewed the first month of the household's new employment system. 3 schedule complaints, Evelyn said. 2 resolved the same day. 1 is still under review. No retaliation? None reported. Keep checking. Evelyn closed the folder. The scholarship portal opened this morning. How many applications? 27 so far. Grant looked surprised. Already? People need help. He nodded. Has Annie applied? Evelyn did not answer. Grant caught himself. Never mind. That is the correct response. He gave her a brief look. You enjoy saying that. More than I should. The restoration specialist entered a few minutes later carrying photographs of Lady Beneath the Cypress. The repair is progressing well, she said. The tier can be stabilized. Some paint loss needs additional work, but the canvas should display well after treatment. Grant studied the photographs. What about the value? There will likely be a reduction. He handed the photographs back. That's fine. The specialist paused, perhaps expecting another question. Grant said, make sure the work is done properly. That's all. After she left, Evelyn looked at him. A month ago, you would have asked for a percentage. I know. His phone buzzed with a message from Daniel Mercer. Preston Hale had signed the final insurance statement, accepting responsibility for the accidental damage, and confirming Annie had no involvement. The insurer considered her fully cleared. Grant forwarded the document to Annie with one sentence. This closes the insurance matter. Your name is cleared in every record connected to the painting. Annie received the message while working on her scholarship essay. She opened the attachment, saved it beside the earlier letters, and replied, "Thank you for making sure it was finished properly." Grant read her answer but did not continue the conversation. At Ruth's table, Annie returned to the essay. She wrote about nursing, about dignity, and about how people often needed respect most when they had the least power to demand it. She did not mention Grant, the painting, or the transplant. When she finished, Ruth read the final paragraph. "This sounds like you. That good or bad? Good applications usually do." Annie uploaded the essay, attached her grades and financial documents, then stopped with the cursor over the submit button. Ruth waited. "If they reject me, I don't want you calling anybody. I won't. And if I get it, nobody gets to say Grant handed it to me. Then let the committee decide." Annie clicked submit. The confirmation appeared on the screen. Application received. She closed the laptop and reached for the tea Ruth had made. Whatever happened next, Annie had entered through the same door as every other applicant. This time, that was exactly how she wanted it. 2 weeks after submitting the scholarship application, Annie was leaving an afternoon lab when her phone vibrated inside her bag. She almost ignored it because her evening shift at Harbor Ridge started in less than an hour, but the subject line stopped her. Whitmore Education Fund Award Decision. She stood near the campus walkway and opened the message. The independent committee had approved her application. The award would cover the remaining tuition balance for the semester, required textbooks, and several academic fees. Renewal would depend on her grades and continued enrollment. Annie read the message again before calling Ruth. Ruth answered with, "You sound like something happened. I got the scholarship." There was a pause, followed by the sound of a cabinet closing. "You got it?" "Yes." "How much?" Annie told her. "Well, praise God and somebody on that committee with good sense." Annie laughed. "I don't know why I feel strange about it. Because the money came from Grant's fund." "Yes." "Did Grant select you?" "No." "Did you meet the requirements?" "Yes." "Did you write the application?" "Yes." "Then stop trying to turn an earned award into a favor." Annie adjusted the strap of her bag. "I still want to know he didn't interfere." "Then ask." Annie hesitated. Ruth continued. "There is nothing wrong with checking whether the process was fair." Annie sent Evelyn Shaw a short email before starting her shift. "I received an award notice today. Before I accept, I need confirmation that Mr. Whitmore did not participate in the selection process or influence the committee regarding my application." Evelyn replied less than 30 minutes later. "Mr. Whitmore did not receive applicant names, scores, essays, or committee discussions. He had no role in selecting recipients. I can provide the governance documents if you would like them." Annie read the message during her break. She responded, "That's enough. Thank you." Then she pressed the acceptance button. Patricia noticed her smiling when she returned to the supply station. "Something good?" "I got a scholarship." "For nursing school?" "Yes." Patricia held out her hand. "Congratulations." Annie shook it. "Thank you. Does that mean you're quitting on me?" "No. I still have expenses." "Good answer. I might need fewer Saturday shifts during exam weeks. That we can discuss when you have the dates." No speech about generosity followed. No one treated Annie like a charity case. Patricia simply made a note and returned to the schedule. Annie appreciated that more than she expected. At Whitmore House, Grant received the scholarship program's first quarterly report. It listed the number of applicants, the amount awarded, and broad demographic information. Recipient names were withheld from him by design. Evelyn placed the report on his desk. 12 awards. Grant read the summary. "Good." One applicant asked whether you had access to individual applications. He immediately understood. "Annie, I'm not confirming that." Grant smiled faintly. "Fair." She received the same answer anyone else would. "That is how it should be." Evelyn closed her folder. The household review is also complete. Several former employees received back pay after timekeeping issues were verified. Grant looked at the total. That is higher than I expected. Walter saved money by making people afraid to question ours, and I praised him for keeping household costs controlled. Evelyn did not answer for him. Grant signed the authorization. Pay it. Already scheduled. He looked up. Then why do you need my signature? Because responsibility should leave a record. Grant signed. Later that week, Lady Beneath the Cypress returned from conservation. The tear was nearly invisible, unless someone knew where to look. The restored painting arrived in a climate-controlled crate, and 2 specialists supervised its placement. Grant stood several feet away as they prepared the wall. One specialist asked, "Same position as before?" Grant looked at the center of the gallery. For years, the portrait had greeted every important guest entering that part of the house. He had used it in photographs, charity events, and interviews. "No." The specialist waited. "Put it on the east wall. That area gets less attention." "I know." The woman nodded and signaled to her colleague. Grant walked toward the central wall after they finished. For once, it held nothing. Maria came through the gallery carrying event linens for an upcoming dinner. She noticed the change. "You moved it?" "Yes. I thought that painting was your favorite thing in the house." Grant looked toward the restored canvas. "I thought so as well." Maria adjusted the linens in her arms. "The repair looks good. They did excellent work." "Did it lose much value?" Grant gave a small shrug. "Enough." Maria waited, perhaps expecting the old Grant to complain. He added, "It can still be seen. It can still be appreciated. I can live with the number being smaller." Maria smiled. "That sounds expensive." Grant almost laughed. It was. That evening, Annie received a message from him. "Evelyn tells me the scholarship committee has completed its first round. I do not know who received awards, and I did not ask. I wanted you to know I kept that promise." Annie read it while sitting at Ruth's kitchen table with an anatomy workbook open. She replied, "I received one." Grant stared at the message for several seconds before answering. "Congratulations. You earned it." Annie typed, "I asked Evelyn whether you interfered." His reply came quickly. "You should have." She smiled. Ruth looked up from a crossword puzzle. "What?" He didn't get offended. "Growth." That sounded sarcastic. It was partly sincere. Annie returned to her workbook, but another message arrived. Grant wrote, "The painting came back today." Annie's fingers paused. "How does it look?" "Almost exactly as it did before." She thought about the wet steps, her ruined books, and the accusation that had nearly changed everything. Then she wrote, "Some things can be repaired." Grant read the sentence and understood what she had not written. He answered, "And some things have to be changed instead." Annie did not reply immediately. Ruth glanced toward her. "You have an exam tomorrow." "I know." "Then whatever a billionaire is saying can wait until after renal physiology." Annie laughed and placed the phone face down. On the table sat her nursing books, her work schedule, and the scholarship acceptance letter. Nothing there had erased the night at Whitmore House. It did not need to. Justice, Annie was beginning to understand, was not always one dramatic moment when the guilty person was exposed. Sometimes it was a corrected record, wages returned, a frightened employee finally heard, a fair process created where none existed before, and a young woman allowed to keep moving without carrying another person's shame. She opened her textbook and returned to studying. 4 years later, Annie stood beneath the white canopy outside the university auditorium, adjusting the blue graduation stole over her gown while Ruth tried to fix a fold that did not need fixing. "Miss Ruth, if you touch this thing one more time, I'm taking it off." Ruth stepped back and examined her work. "You can complain after the pictures. You have taken 30 pictures." 32. Annie laughed and shook her head. Around them, families moved toward the entrance carrying flowers, cameras, and programs. Annie held her nursing pin inside one hand, running her thumb across the small metal edge. The years between her first semester and this morning had been filled with early classes, evening shifts, clinical rotations, exams, bus rides, coffee reheated more times than she wanted to admit, and many nights at Ruth's kitchen table. Her scholarship had renewed every year because she kept the required grades. She had continued working at Harbor Ridge until her final clinical semester, when Patricia helped reduce her schedule. Now a hospital in Charleston had offered Annie a nursing position beginning Monday. Ruth noticed the way she was holding the pin. "You nervous? About the ceremony? About everything after it?" Annie smiled. "A little." "Good." "Good?" Means you understand it matters. Annie reached for Ruth's hand. I wish Mom could see this. Ruth squeezed her fingers. She would have worn out everybody around her talking about you. Annie laughed softly. She probably would. She absolutely would. A voice behind them said, I believe she would have had competition. Annie turned. Grant Whitmore stood several feet away in a dark suit, holding a small bouquet of white flowers. His hair had more gray than it had 4 years earlier, and the sharpness Annie once associated with him had eased into something less guarded. Mr. Whitmore. Annie. Ruth looked at the flowers. You brought something reasonable. I'm impressed. Grant smiled. I was advised against anything that required delivery trucks. That was good advice. Annie accepted the flowers. Thank you. I wasn't sure whether to bring them inside. They're fine. Grant nodded toward the auditorium. I have a seat in the back. You could have gotten a better one. I could have. Annie understood the choice and said nothing about it. Grant had stayed in contact over the years, but only when Annie allowed it. He never asked the university for her grades. He never contacted her employers. He never used the transplant story in interviews or charity speeches. The scholarship fund had grown beyond its original size. Annie learned from Evelyn's annual public report that more working students were receiving awards, including people who had never heard her name. Whitmore House had changed as well. Staff policies remained in place after the attention surrounding Walter disappeared. Grant continued funding outside review even when nobody was watching. None of that erased the night he sent Annie into the rain. It was not supposed to. It showed that apology could become behavior instead of remaining a sentence. An announcement called graduates toward the entrance. Ruth immediately reached for her phone. One more picture. Annie groaned. You promised 32. I changed the contract. Grant stepped beside Ruth. Do I get a copy? If you behave. Annie laughed as Ruth took the picture. The ceremony lasted nearly 2 hours. Ruth cried before Annie's row was even called. Grant noticed and offered her a handkerchief. I have tissues, Ruth whispered. Then why are you using your program? Ruth looked down at the damp corner. Mind your business. When Annie's name was announced, Ruth stood so quickly she nearly dropped her phone. Annie Carter. Several people nearby laughed. Annie crossed the stage and accepted her diploma holder, hearing Ruth's voice above the applause. She found Grant in the back rows. He was standing. He did not call out. He simply clapped until she left the stage. After the ceremony, they met near a row of live oaks outside the auditorium. Annie had already taken pictures with classmates, faculty, and Ruth when Grant approached. Congratulations, Nurse Carter. Annie raised an eyebrow. Not officially until Monday. I can wait. Ruth joined them. She made us wait 4 years. You can survive 4 days. Monday is 4 days away? Grant looked genuinely uncertain. Annie laughed. Don't ask him to calculate anything that doesn't have a dollar sign. Grant placed one hand over his chest. That was unnecessary. It was accurate. Ruth excused herself to answer a phone call, leaving Annie and Grant near the walkway. Grant looked at Annie's diploma holder. You did it. I did. You know, 4 years ago I thought the most valuable thing in my house was a painting. Annie's smile faded into something more thoughtful. You were wrong. I was. You were wrong about a lot of things. Grant gave a small nod. I know. They stood together as people passed around them. Grant said, the museum asked to borrow Lady Beneath the Cypress for an exhibition next year. Are you letting them? Yes. That painting survived quite a story. So did we. Annie looked at him. Grant corrected himself. You survived it. I learned from it. That's better. He smiled. There was one question he had asked Annie every year around the anniversary of his transplant, and only after she had told him he was allowed to ask it. How are you feeling? Healthy. Still doing your follow-ups? Yes. Good. Annie tilted her head. What about you? Appointments, medication, diet, all the things my doctors have been repeating for years. Good. I even reduced the salt. I don't believe that. Ruth has been monitoring me. That explains it. Grant laughed. Ruth called Annie from across the lawn. We have lunch reservations. I'm coming. Annie turned back to Grant. Are you joining us? If that invitation is real. It is. Grant nodded. Annie began walking, then stopped. One more thing. What? She pointed lightly toward his side. Take care of that kidney, Mr. Whitmore. I worked hard for it. Grant laughed, but his eyes filled. I will. Annie joined Ruth and her friends near the parking lot. graduation gown moving around her ankles as she walked. 4 years earlier, she had left Whitmore House carrying wet books and a torn bag, while a powerful man decided her value from the clothes she wore and the work she performed. Today, she carried a nursing degree, a job offer, and a future she had built through effort, help accepted on fair terms, and the refusal to let another person's judgment become her identity. Grant watched her for a moment before following. He had spent most of his life believing value could be measured by property, reputation, and numbers on a balance sheet. Annie had taught him something none of those numbers could explain. Price was what something cost. Worth was what remained when money had nothing left to say. This story reminds us that a person's worth should never be measured by money, status, race, or the job they do. Annie deserved respect long before anyone knew she had saved Grant's life. True justice begins when we listen before judging, speak up when someone is treated unfairly, and take responsibility for the harm our choices cause. Wealth can replace a damaged painting, but dignity, trust, and kindness cannot be bought. In the end, the greatest measure of a person is not what they own, but how they treat those who have less power than they do. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only,